Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Yeah. Zoom, 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 zoom. Zoom, zoom. Pew, pew. Pew, pew. Pew, pew. Welcome, everyone, to another Underworld party. Let out a big sigh of relief. Take refuge in this nonsense that we are about to engage in. Allow yourself to melt into technobabble, gibberish, rhetoric, and other forms of linguistic nonsense that will not make your life any better at all. I promise. I promise. If you find that you want to know more, please go to bodyalter.org. That's BODYALTAR.org. If you go to ALTER, you might get some kind of tattoo shop in the UK. I can't make any promises. And for the Patreon, patreon.com, Animist Arts, where we do lots of cool animist artsy things, and that's what these interviews are gonna be about. So if you find that things are helpful for you, please donate. That would be great. PayPal.me/daresohei, DARESOHEI. And of course, all this information is below the video or the audio that you're listening to now, so you don't have to remember it. But I wanted to say it. So today, I have a guest today with a myriad of desires and passions that fuse together in a interesting way that I cannot comprehend, and that's why I want to have this conversation. Everyone, please welcome Matthew Stillman. Matthew, welcome to the Underworld Party. Thank you for joining me/us.
So charmed. It's been a long time coming. You and I have circled around each other for a couple of years. It's our first
Circling and
conversation.
circling. Yes, circling and
We're
circling. It's true. Where did we
spiraling.
first start circling? Where was that?
I think we first started spiraling around movement stuff, around Fighting Monkey, um, some
Yep.
years ago.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where I first remember, but I don't know where it went from there.
It's true. The fighting monkey thing. That's real. That's super real. That's my pre-pandemic, pre-weight gain life. You know.
Yeah, yeah. I still am involved with Fighting Monkey material, and obviously haven't in the last year and a half gone to see them much, except for digitally. But I've been really informed by um, their skill building and their approach and their playful considerations about remixing and bricolaging traditional Taoist stuff with coordination and movement. They're brilliant
Yes, it's
people.
true. They are brilliant. They are brilliant. They are also very expensive now and highly in demand. But yes, the very interesting stuff. I especially like the kind of the coordinations are definitely cool, and they're like
Brain scrambling, body scrambling.
brain
Uh,
scrambling, body scrambling, kind of like remixed African rhythms, I probably would say.
Absolutely, there's that too. Just what I love, though, I mean, there's lots of things to love about their particular approach to coordinations, is that they really want to give you longer phrases than just 1 2 1 2, which are very easily repeatable. They really want to get you undone, so you actually can discover something, as opposed to, I know how to keep this, 2 3, 3 4 beat or whatever. So they really sort of undo the Western rock beat that allows you to sort of go back and forth
Right.
pretty easily.
Right. Yeah, it's a much more polyrhythmic kind of thing with
Much more
like sevens,
polyrhythmic.
sevens and eights and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and it makes me want to get back into it. That's real. That's super real. Well, so there's a number of things that you participate in that you practice, right? Like Matthew, you are kind of like me, but probably even more disciplined. You practice a lot of things. It
Yeah,
seems like you practice a lot of things, and they seem to sort of like inspire them, like they're cross inspirational, you know?
Yeah.
How would you describe what it is that you practice, or what is your art? Like yeah, what is your art, Matthew?
Um, my art, if anything, is just to keep on stumbling forward with perhaps a little bit of skill and a little bit of art. So it's definitely falling, and if I'm lucky, to fall forward. That's probably
That's the thing.
it. Um, but I mean, the some of the, I mean, if you had to describe it, I wouldn't say it's a quilt or a collage. Maybe it's a forest floor mat of different leaves that have fallen off related trees, and some are green and some have absolutely rotted away, but they definitely seem like they should be there. And you may think like, oh, that's a maple and that's a fern, but they have a network together for sure. And
Mhm.
so all the people who are listening may not know who the hell I am, and or why they should be listening to this. Um, Maybe that'll be revealed over this conversation or other ones. But when I think about looking back at the last 25 years of my life, and of course, and I'm 48 now, um, I can see like, oh right, these things which seemed like I was stumbling just to make choices really have a deep thread between them, which is something about the skill of grief, which is something about the fracture between sex and spirit in our non-culture, what you might call an antibiotic that we live in.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, totally.
there's something about history. There's something about sense making. There's something about food, um, and there's something about meaning making. Those are some of the things,
Yeah,
um, and knowing something about bodies as well. Those are all in there, and I don't think those are unconnected.
right, right. And just speaking from sort of like more pre in time than you. I'm 40. I'm about to be 42 in December, and I didn't think I would live this long. Did you think you would make it to 48?
No, the last 8 years or so, I haven't been able to imagine a future for myself beyond 6 months. I
Yeah.
just have not been able to imagine a future at all. And I don't know if you ever had the experience driving, um, where you're not sure if you should take this exit or not, and you take the exit and you realize within 15 seconds, like, oh God, I was not supposed to take that exit. And then it's like 50 miles so you can make a turnaround. And I'm pretty convinced that from a young age, I was like, I'm not sure I was supposed to be here.
Right,
And so I've just been like, I guess I'm still driving on this. So
right.
there's that too. And like there's those first 30 miles, you're like, if I could just jump over this, I could get back. But I'll never kill myself. I'll just as
You
they
have
say,
to
life,
wait. You have
yeah.
to wait for the merry-go-round to stop so you can get off.
That's exactly right. Life is not for everyone, but since I'm here, I'm like, I guess I'll try to do the best I can manage, but I'm not like, seize
Totally.
the day. I'm like, just keep going.
Yeah, yeah, that's the yeah, it's not seize the day, it's keep going. It's
Yeah.
just like, putter along.
Yeah.
Okay, just putter
Putter,
along.
yeah, putter, fall forward. Can you fall forward with a little bit of art? Like there's that incredible Charlie Chaplin sequence where he tumbles forward and falls through the gears like he was a piece of plastic going through a film machine, and he just sort
Right.
of like does that rolling. And I mean, if only I was as good as that as Chaplin is, but that's a bit of my feeling. Like, well, I'll get ground up by the next thing I roll into. Keep rolling.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but like Chaplin and a lot of this like when movies first started and they became and it was really just physical theater.
Yeah,
It was like not actually what we think of as movies. They were not very complicated
or
play.
not at
Like
all. Yeah,
it was very much like bad guy steals food from good guy, like
yeah.
whatever. But like the sort of like primariness or the primacy of like the movement and the body in those old movies where it's like on some level I would just want to hang out with Chaplin just to like see his like feel what his posture was like. Like there's
Oh my
something
God.
animal to it, right? Where it's like you
Yeah,
want to stand next to a wild animal because their body is sort of teaching you something just by doing what it's doing in gravity, right?
Absolutely. Chaplin, Keaton, and there's so many others, but there is an absolute softness to them. While they are not martial artists in the way that you would normally think of a martial artist, they absolutely have that Wu Wei quality um, to their
Yeah,
movement, even in their non-movement positions. They're
right.
just as like a readiness that's
Yeah.
in them.
Yeah, it makes me want to rewatch just to do like the somatics of Chaplin article
Oh my
series or
God.
whatever.
The somatics of Chaplin's would be so amazing, but the somatics of Keaton would be even more thrilling, much more athletic.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, maybe that's the thing. And this is what I like about, having these chats with people. I don't fucking know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so now I'm like thinking about the somatics of Chaplin, which is like, I would not have been thinking of that this morning.
No, me
Thank
neither.
you for that.
But, I know that you've been on properly so about what it's like to be, in the lower body, whatever you want to call that. And that there is a, let's say at best, a fractured memory in the West about what it's like to be uh, instrumentally in the low part of the body, wherever that low is.
Hmm.
Um, and that there are like these little, in the same way that little bundles of green crack their way through concrete and may never become giant trees, but they're absolutely a sign of something pushing against the pavement. Um, that we're lucky enough, if you have an eye, to be able to not to turn your eye and then to turn your ear to see, like actually see what is trying to speak through the pavement. And so someone like Chaplin, who is like venerated, but just sort of more like he's a genius, as opposed to really looking at and becoming a student of his work.
Yeah.
And not to say that I'm some sort of profound student of his work, but I mean, I'm
No.
not ignorant of it.
Yeah.
That's like a little touch of this is what it could look like to be completely a Western person and to be in your body and to be in the low part of your body.
Right. And to sort of like, and it's interesting, like the leading cause of death at a certain age is falling down, right? For like Western people, for Westerners, right? Oh, hold on, folks. We got a technical difficulty. Okay. So we're back. We're back. But, just something, in the West, because we're largely a sedentary culture that sits in chairs
Yep.
and that at a certain age, Western elderly folk can't get up from the ground anymore.
Yeah.
So falling becomes like one of the most dangerous things ever.
Yep.
And that's really interesting because we live in a gravity field. So we, like that's like saying air is very dangerous, right?
Hmm.
Like that it's like saying breathing becomes very dangerous because you're not used to breathing. Oh, uh-oh. So there's an
Yeah.
uh-oh there. And there is something about like even if we take away the whiteness, even if we take away the colonization and all these political terms that piss people off and freak them out because there's spirits attached to them, and we just say, hey, wouldn't it be great if you weren't afraid of falling down?
Yeah.
Like, hey, hey, Americans, hey, white people, what if when you actually fell down, you didn't break your hip and you didn't break your knee, and you didn't sprain your ankle and you didn't break your back? Like, what if that was just like a thing that like you weren't, there was not a problem, It was just
Of
not a,
course, I mean, that would be brilliant. But at the same time, let's just say that you're 83, you've had 82 years of basically being practiced and told and uh, contorted around the idea that the earth isn't alive and that you shouldn't be close to it. It's dirty. The real work happens up here.
yep,
Sit up straight. So if you've been practicing that and you don't know a different way, how could you see anything else but falling that 2.5 feet, whatever the standard height of a chair is?
right.
Um, which of course, is the same by and large, whether you're in Portland or New York or Tokyo. Like chairs are now standardized, like what your hip angle should be.
Yeah, yeah,
And so there's no traveling when it comes to being in a chair because
yeah,
it pretty much makes the sense. I love every once in a while when you get a chance to sit in a toddler's chair. It's like a really different experience. I actually sort of like them to be in that deeper, but every once in a while you find like a chair that just its own thing. and that just higher. I love those.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I
that
like
poor
them with the
83-year-old
full
person.
size chairs.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Like in Asia, they have chairs that are kind of like tables.
yeah,
And you can like you could kind of lay on them or sit on them or whatever. They're like big as coffee tables and they're like a
yeah,
weird height and it's like, oh, this is like this is what they do here. They just have these like table chairs
yeah.
sometimes.
But of course, like a table chair, a chair and a table that has a deep relationship to forks and plates, the
Yeah.
way that we eat. So if you have a plate needs a table. I mean, of course, it doesn't actually, but it
Yeah.
facilitates this movement. And so uh, in Asia, just to pick a place, they usually eat with chopsticks and bowls, and that's much so that doesn't require a table, which
Nope.
allows them to be much more deep in a squat.
Yeah.
People sit on the bottom of a squat and eat in a bowl and a chopstick. So chopsticks, fine motor coordination, deep squat, not needing a table, needing a chairs of different heights. It all changes, and so these small things of architecture in our environments make huge choices for us down the road, which is what, fascinatingly, in Asia, they have far less old age dementia than they do in the West. And it's attributed to this fine motor coordination that's been cultivated over their entire lives and the deep squatting. So you have better venous return in your legs into your hips into your brain.
Right. Exactly. So like you're getting it all together, it's like you have to keep eating if you want to live. So
Yeah,
and instead of making that as easy as possible, you make it only a little bit easy. You're
yeah,
like,
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But it allows you to eat more food. So of course this speaks to like a deep trauma in that comes from European based people, that there wasn't always enough. So how do we get the most in fast? Plate, fork, more food, less motor coordination, shove it in while we still have it.
yeah,
That's a consuming spirit in the West.
that's really interesting to think about because it's true that if I just have a big spoon, I can just kind of do this.
Yeah,
I could just kind of shovel it in. And I'm guilty of that. Like I don't personally like chew as much as I want to.
oh,
Like
definitely not. Me
there's
neither.
I chew a few times and then my mind goes somewhere else and I swallow instead of like being with the food.
Yeah,
And even though I know consciously, like, yeah, I should just slow down, chew more, I just don't.
yeah, it's not easy. um the habits are so deeply ingrained. um yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
I've wondered about that too, and I don't know that it's a. I don't want to pathologize and say it's a problem to be solved, but I also don't want to turn into like a hyper mindful person who's like, okay,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
let's
yeah.
let's pay attention before we start eating. Let's fall still,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
feel the weight of your tongue in your
Give
mouth.
it to
Okay,
us.
yeah,
Give it to us with those dulcet tones, Matthew. Yes, we have now entered the trance state of
yeah. I mean,
mind.
there's something about that bliss bubble version of mindfulness, which is so nauseating and sad. Though there is, of course, a little grain to it, which is completely valid. Like, can you actually be with a thing longer than you just normally think that it's going to exist?
Yeah.
Um, I do a game that I play with people when I do body work for them, uh, and the game is that I have them clap their hands front to back, so this way, so not palm to palm, but back to front. So I do it 3 times really hard, like whack, 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 like that, and then sit there in silence to see how long it is till the sensation is gone.
Uh-huh.
And people are always amazed that it lasts longer. And then when they say, okay, it's done, I'm like, are you sure? And without, that's just a cue. Because I'm like, oh, I guess I wanted it to be done and it was done enough. I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. That there actually is the capacity for this long tail of touch, that the sensation can exist so much. And if you bump your elbow as you're leaving the house and you're like, fuck, I don't have time for this, it's a completely important skill to be able to cut it off and say,
Yes.
I can't deal with it. But
Yeah,
if
yeah.
your elbow hurts 2 days later and you're like, what the hell happened?
Yes.
And that's not a guarantee that that will happen, but just that like that happens often, that when you cut the paint off, it doesn't ever have a chance to shake itself out. I think that's an important thing for a nervous system to recognize, that there's so much more capacity just on time. Um, so yeah, and of course we're being touched by still having touches unfold that we got touched in when we were kids, or yesterday, or today, or ones that we initiated as well. So we're in this tangle of blessings, hard and soft blessings.
Well, that's really fun to think about, just like the long tail of touch,
Yeah.
the kind of like, and I've been thinking a lot about time recently as kind of like an deity,
Oh yeah. For
and so,
real.
like I think about like long, like, yeah, there's this idea of length through time, and then time also that's non-linear, so it's almost like rhizomatic time, right?
Absolutely.
It's a kind of like holistic time, and Gebser would call it like time freedom, which
Mhm.
is like time that's not bound by its own self-limiting idea of itself.
Yep.
Which is
Okay.
kind of how we experience time. We experience time in a kind of limited way, and especially in the modern West, we experience time as rushing forward too quickly for ourselves to deal with, right? Like
Absolutely.
this is generally what I feel like most of the time. Like I don't
Sure.
have enough time. Like what the
Yeah.
fuck does that mean? I don't
Yeah.
have
But there's all the cues around us like make sure of that. So it's not, mercy to you and mercy to me. So keep
sure.
going.
Yeah, and so you're saying, there's this this sort of unfolding of touch that's still happening from the past into the present, and you're telling people, stay with that, with these three claps, these three slaps of the back of your hand. And what, just I had a question I wanted to ask you too, which was in this vein, which was when you're at the beginning of practicing or initiating someone else into your practice, which is, I guess, like body work, right? It's like, hey, do you really want to go down this road with me? This is how I'm going to travel, right?
Yep.
Yeah, this is my style of consent, right? So,
Yep.
I was wondering, like, okay, so that's the bodywork piece, like, I'm sure there's more too, which you can definitely,
Yeah, of
tell
course.
us if you feel good. But I was also thinking about how do you sort of enter into improv? Because I also know that you're like big into improv. You've written a book about improv, and that to me is also like a kind of entering a threshold, right? It's like you're in a you're entering some kind of non-ordinary reality to do improv.
Yeah.
So how do you enter that, or how do you tell other people to enter that space?
Well, I think improv in particular has a really good um, framework for it, which is that you're not doing it by yourself, which I think is a really, I mean, not to say that there isn't such a thing as solo improv, there is. I think it's really, really challenging to do, to be so, um, have your own boundaries so unlimited that you can make suggestions that are a surprise to yourself. Um,
Ooh, ah.
I mean, and say things that you don't even know. Like it's possible, like, but it's hard. I mean, that's a real skill to be so undone. But broadly, I'd say that the fact that you are in a, I'd say, a ceremonial space with other people who have been practicing the same types of games as you are, and that you have a loose structure, not what's going to happen, in the same way that like basketball players don't know what's going to happen, but they know how to dribble, they know how to play, they know where the general goal is. And then that ceremonial space is held by at least one, although possibly two, um, guides. If you're practicing, it's being held by a coach who, if you're lucky, is sort of like a shaman. And I say that word very lightly. That's a very tortured word,
Yeah, yeah, of
um,
course.
but just in the sense that they are actually holding the space because they're saying like less of this and more of this, and watch this spirit that's being summoned or not. Or if you're in the wild, as it were, the audience is that guide that's holding you as well, and their measure of laughter or their measure of silence is are the the inner hand and the outer hand of the potter's wheel to say like more expansion or more contraction.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
so for me, like, all the practice of, making funny sounds or speaking in accents or saying yes and or elevating the game, doing movement practices together, all those things are developing the skills of dribbling, shooting, foul shooting, footwork, whatever you do in basketball, have all those same sort of uh, relationalities in the improv space. But for me, I didn't, when I started doing improv in 1996, or long form improv in 1996, and Amy Poehler, the famous Amy Poehler, was my first improv
No,
teacher.
no, that's the other Amy Poehler.
The other Amy Poehler. Um, she revealed she was an incredible teacher and an incredible person. Um, and I learned a tremendous amount from her. But she said that everything that she had learned about being a good person, she learned about on stage and from improv, and that was her church. And for me, as being a young, and she wasn't that much older than I was. I mean, 2 years, I think. Um, but she'd been improvising longer, and for sure. Um, but as someone who was really interested in religion and spirituality and meaning making and history, that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was like, oh wow, if this was her church, like this was her religion, and I could see why it was. It made me think about the inverse, and made me think, what can all the great spiritual texts teach us about improv that are not that are really alive rules? And so I started to wonder about that and wrote that book about that. But it made me think about this cross fertilization of ideas. Like, how do you mash things together that don't immediately seem to have a place together, and see what emerges from them? So that, connected to my another book of mine, which I wrote, which was erotica and the Bible. So like, what are like, how do you cross these things where never the twain shall meet, and see what sort of beauty can make?
Yeah.
Um, so those are some of the structures and about how I've approached improv, which was that it's ceremonial, that you're trying to summon something, and that you are, if you're lucky,
Yes,
a,
yes.
a conduit for this, for the spirit that is the suggestion. So whether that suggestion is, melon baller or nut hatch or jumping jack flash or whatever it is, see if you can find that
Right,
and summon it. And it can't happen right away. It takes, you know, foundations and teamwork to build that, and
right,
years of skill making allow that to emerge.
right. And sort of like, for me, I like, smaller forms of that, like bibliomancy
Oh, totally.
or like exquisite corpse writing styles or poetry where you're kind of
Mhm.
just like you're trying to shake the 8-ball snow globe of the mind to make a left when it wants to make a right. And this
Absolutely.
is that thing. It's like my habituated pattern is to go da 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 da.
Yep.
Like my habituated rhythm is this, and
Yep.
that feels good for my body, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean,
Yeah.
look at Leonard Cohen, made almost a history of like the same
It's the same
poem,
fucking rhythm. Totally. Well,
rhythm, right?
this goes back to what we like about Fighting Monkey, is that they're taking you to in 7/8 speed to phrases that are long beyond 16 bars, and you need to try to feel them in your body, and you can't remember them.
Yeah,
So
right.
this is it.
Yeah, and so it's interesting to me to sort of go because this is almost my full circle too. It's like I really didn't even take up the mantle animus till long after I was like, oh yeah, I do improv, and like, oh yeah, I dance a lot, and like, oh yeah, I'm a practitioner of physical theater, or like, I'm a physical theater actor. I actually was able to say yes to those identities
Mm,
way before I was able to be like, oh yeah, animism is already what I've been trying to do.
yeah.
And then, but then this combinatorial creativity you talk about where you're trying to remix and mash up, and it's not the same as appropriation because you're actually really honoring the root material and the root culture. You're really
Yeah.
like, this thing arose in these contexts. I'm not in that context anymore, but that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to recreate the context. I'm just trying to sort of like pass the ball. It's like a hot potato, right?
Yep.
You get past a hot potato. It could be an idea, an erotic sensation as an idea.
Yeah.
You get
Totally.
past this hot potato and you're like, what if? Like you're like Eros in the Bible or erotica in the Bible. you just got past some hot potatoes and you said yes to them, and then you did something with those potatoes. You turned them into potato soup or something, like you were like, oh, I'm gonna,
Yeah,
but it doesn't mean you invented potatoes. You know what I
definitely not.
mean? Like,
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous I mean, it's sort of looked down upon improvisers, but um, where Del Close, who's sort of like the godfather of long form improv, was doing a scene with Joan Rivers, the famous Joan Rivers, as opposed to the not famous Joan Rivers. Um, and Del Close says, "But what about the children?" And she says, "We don't have any children." And she gets a huge laugh from the audience. But it was like this classic denial where he just said, "Well, we have children," and so. And so this is looked upon as improvisers like, it's so important to say yes and not just go for the laugh. What could have emerged if you'd said yes? And so, when I wrote my book, Genesis Deflowered, which is taking uh, the book of Genesis, the King James Bible, full of these and thous, um, someone asked me to help them do research on weird erotica. And so I found, there's plenty of weird erotica out there, demons and werewolves and whatever. And I found this short book that was an erotic retelling of Mary getting pregnant by the Spirit of God. And it was terrible in every way you could possibly imagine,
yes.
from spelling to grammar to just like it being gross. Like just
Fuck.
terrible. But what I found in the Amazon reviews for it was there was like 50 reviews of it, and all of them said something like, "Oh my God, I've never realized what a special woman Mary was and how beautiful she must have been. I feel closer to God than ever. Like, I never realized that Jesus was part of this incredible erotic spirit." And I was like, but it was Amazon reviews. And I was like, this is such garbage writing, and it's eliciting like real spiritual vigor from people. Like, that's how parched that space was, that this piece of garbage was looking good to these people.
Oh,
And I thought,
amazing.
there has to be like, I know I can do something better. How do you, like, whether you're a believer or not, whether you're but if you live in the West, your language, your framework for understanding what left and right is, or up and down, or anything, is just from the King James Bible. You could think it's the stupidest thing in the world. I guarantee you, just phraseologies are coming from there. Your ontology,
Yes.
your metaphysics are from there,
Yes.
not
Yes.
only there. And so
Yes.
I thought, like, it would be very easy in a way to say, like, Eve had big tits and Adam's cock was amazing, and the knowledge of tree and evil, whatever you want to say, like, and just do
Ooh,
that.
tell me
I'll
more.
tell you
Oh.
more. But I was like, that's actually, there's no skill in that, to just stick a thumb in the eye of the Bible, and just like tit it up and cock it up and cunt it up. Like, what do you get from that? And so I said, if I was going to write this, I really need to meet it, as you say, like, to honor the potato that just was given to me. So not that I hadn't read Jacobean or Elizabethan poetry, I certainly had, but I really was like, okay, I'm going to meet it on its own terms. And what would a Jacobean or Elizabethan poet who was in touch with their lower body and had to write something about what was in some ways really right there in the Bible about erotic spirit, what would they say? And so I did a deep dive on the erotic verse of that time and started to see about the way that they spoke about things, and wrote all my additions, and didn't take a word away except for where agreements and sentences would change it, and just added text. And so when I actually had formerly religious people, like former priests or active nuns, saying, I couldn't always tell where the Bible ended and when you started, and this made me feel things that I wished I'd had when I was 16 or 18, was so moving to me. When I found out that that book was being used as a recovery text for Jehovah's Witnesses around the country, and it was, because that book is a book of biblical erotica written in Elizabethan English. It has not burned up the charts, let's be clear.
Yeah,
um,
but I totally want to see it now. I'm like really into it. I'm
oh, it's cool. But it's sold pretty well for that type of book year after year. And I found out a couple of years ago that it's being used as a recovery text for people who've been so traumatized by Jehovah's Witnesses in particular. Um, and so, do I make like a grand or two a year from this book? Yeah, that's amazing.
That's amazing.
I wouldn't have guessed that that was who my calling was for, but it had been. So
That's some spicy potato soup,
that
Matthew.
is mashed potato soup. The soup
It
is so
keeps
spicy.
on, and it's like the soup, the never-ending soup bowl of Magic Cauldron.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
It's like I want more soup this year.
Yeah. Totally.
Well, that's fantastic. And you also wrote a book uh, enmeshing or remixing the Ten Commandments with improv comedy. That's right, true, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, that was called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Mount Sinai. The Ten Commandments as a Guide to Long Form Improvisational Comedy. Again, another huge seller. Tremendous. I mean,
So
the
fantastic.
number of weeks that was on, I forget how many weeks that was on the New York Times bestseller list.
Yeah,
It's
massive,
massive,
massive.
absolutely massive. Yeah,
Didn't they? Didn't they? Didn't they have like a parade for you down Main Street?
oh, yeah. I mean,
Down Broadway in New York
Canyon,
City.
the Canyon of Heroes, absolutely. It was just me and tens of thousands of people throwing confetti at my feet. It was incredible.
Yeah.
It's one of the highlights of my life. Really surprised too. Yeah, that book. Again, like the people who read it really liked it, and it was a minor hit in the improv community around New York and LA. Great. But yeah, that book looked at the Ten Commandments, like the famous Ten Commandments, and looked at each of them as rules for play, for rules of play and improv in particular.
Which was there one that was like that you enjoyed out of these 10? Was there one that you were like still using? Like you're still like, I really personally get a lot out of this commandment as it pertains to long form improv.
I mean, the one that people were sort of most interested in was, which it seems sort of natural to me, but a lot of people sort of were surprised by, was the one about thou shalt not kill. Um, and so that one is, there's a difference between killing and murdering. And
Okay,
so,
yeah.
and so um, that nuance of the way that I played that out about what is a lawful killing, and who is the thou, and what is murder, and why is that, and just playing that out for me, like it's absolutely important that there was a place for death in improv. You have to be able to end things. You have to be able to end things, but end things wasn't necessarily killing them. And so using that as a scene, when you're a young improviser, you're told like never actually like kill someone on stage. It's ending the scene. Like fair, and a more sophisticated improviser might be able to do something differently. But what is killing a scene? What is ending it? What is breathing life back into it? What is putting it down for a minute to be able to pick it back up? And so I just sort of meditated on that because but a lot of people were like, oh wow, this actually makes you look at the commandment itself differently, which was part of my goal. Um,
Yeah, fascinating.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this too, like the death phobia in the West, which is still a kind of death addiction in some weird way,
Oh
right?
yeah. It's a death
Like
cult,
like we're in a death cult, but not the cool kind.
not the cool kind.
Not the cool kind that like does death practice and treats every day preciously because it might be the last. Like we're not that kind of death cult. We're a different kind of death cult, which might let's and what would you say if we were to rename it? Would we be a killing cult or a murdering cult?
I would say that we are a murdering cult, um, because it's ruthless. There's no uh, life that comes on the other side of it. Um, there's no sense of circularity to it. Like there's a place. There absolutely is a place for killing. I mean, part of what I said in the book is that who is the thou who's doing the killing? If you think of yourself as just a singular person and just an individual being,
Little me.
hello, little me, you don't get to just kill. If the thou is a group and there's a ceremony to it, and you don't just get off the hook, be like, there's 10 of us doing it, ergo it's cool. There's a real skill to this. But if
Yeah.
your death feeds life, if your culture feeds culture, if you're, I mean, and I totally know what you mean by death practice, but I think there's even more to it than that, which is a grief practice,
Yeah.
because there's a sense that just proximity alone gives you the skill. Like, oh, I kill chickens, I kill rabbits, I know where my food comes from. Like, ergo, you just sort of ipso facto through, you osmotically know how to grieve. Well, I think there's more to it than just death practice, though I know exactly what you mean.
Right.
So I'd say that we're a murder cult because there's no sense that death feeds life and that there's nothing
Yeah,
on the
and
other end.
there's no real like honoring of that which dies to continue the life cycle either.
Yeah, and it's you who is doing it. There's so much of. I mean, I was talking with someone just 2 days ago, um, and they brought up the notion about like how amazing ayahuasca is. Like that's not getting like too deep into that, but um, I said, that's interesting. You know, the way that indigenous people originally used it was that one person would do ayahuasca for the entire village like every 50 years. And you'd be involved with preparing for that, and it would never be for you. And that one vision that one person got would hold people for decades. And then only once the rubber plantation trauma started to happen did indigenous people start to use that regularly individually to help them deal with the trauma, which sort of looks a little bit like what white people do when they go down to have their own little things. I mean, if you squint real hard. But
Right.
when white people use their own spiritual whole to use an indigenous person's traumatized response to deal with trauma, you get all sorts of nasty invaginations.
Uh-huh.
Um, but the person was pushing back, was like, but how do you not get your own vision if you need that? I'm like, your notion of individuality is like really getting in the way of this. And so
Yeah.
this notion of that it's just like because you're in a group, it's good. It's that's pretty unachieved.
Yeah. No, no.
Again, mercy to those who have that understanding. And I don't put
Right.
myself up on some sort of like ninja master, but I just have a lot of hesitation before I would leap into something like that because my notion of individualism definitely exists, and my skill towards being village minded is maybe better than your average bear, but still threadbare.
Oh yeah, we're impoverished. I was thinking about this
Totally
the other
impoverished.
day. I was thinking about this, because I think about this all the time and stuff like that, where it's like in my own life, yes, I've done ayahuasca. Yes, I've done many other entheogens. Yes, I've done some with really great rituals and some with not great rituals and some with no rituals at all. And those turned out to be better rituals, like,
Yep.
and so
Sure.
I've done this large swath in my life of, things that are maybe dangerous or risky and had consequences from that. Some beautiful consequences, some tragic consequences. I mean, they're all kind of beautiful, even the tragic ones.
Sure.
I was recognizing that the last time I got a clear message was probably about 4 years ago. Like a clear message, which was like you could call it like a vision, which is like you just kind of know your path for a while.
Yeah.
Like you really get like they put you on a train and they just say ride this frickin' train until it stops and you're like okay.
Yeah.
And I rode the train for like 4 years or something and it was a wild train ride, like let me tell you.
I believe
But
it.
I recognized, or I'm just thinking about it recently, that like I got off that train, or that train stopped, and it doesn't
Yeah.
mean that like that's bad. I'm not necessarily sad about it. I'm not necessarily happy about it.
Yeah.
I'm just awareing to the fact that the train stopped. I got off, and I'm now wandering around, and I'm just like, oh, I don't really know where I'm going anymore, and
Yeah.
I I kind of can't go backwards. The train is not going to drive the other way. I could sort of find a new train if I was that kind of person, but I recognize something in myself which I'm wrestling with, which is not a problem wrestling. I'm not like, you know, just wrestling to wrestle, which is that like I'm not the same person I was at the beginning of that train ride.
Yep.
I don't necessarily I can actually witness my own craving for a vision to tell me what to do with my life,
Yeah.
you know? And I can go, wow, this is my impoverished culture being body constantly looking for the future to make the present bearable.
Yeah.
And something about improv and other kinds of artistic processes, rituals, dance, song, sex, body work, all these things that are like it's really a lot easier to stay in the present when you're doing those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Present is
Um,
actually bearable in those ways more often, and I'm not, if I can bias my life towards those kinds of processes and practices, I can kind of go, yeah, Dare, you don't need to find another train.
yeah,
But I'm just noticing as a person enculturated as a white man, who is clearly not a white man, but I have that in me, and
yeah,
that part of the cultural ghost is talking through me all the time. Find a new vision, find a new purpose. What's your purpose? What's your
yeah,
grand fucking poobah of potato land, like,
yeah,
and I recognize that in the culture too is like, I need to have, how many ayahuasca ceremonies is enough?
yeah, yeah,
It's one enough? One every 50 years? No, that's not enough, clearly. One every
yeah, not,
5 years? No, it's not enough. Not enough. And now
yeah,
we're like one every, like 10 every year. Oh, maybe that's enough. But it's like, I think that that's also that time fixation speeding up thing, I think, at play, where
yeah,
it's like, but in older times, I think people had a much more spacious sense of time, and therefore one vision in one lifetime was enough.
yeah,
It was enough. You could just keep mining it for gold. It never ended, right? It's just like there forever.
yeah,
You're in a dream, you return to the dream shows you new things. It's the same dream.
yeah,
We're not there yet or anymore in this culture. And I think that it's part of this like speeding up of time where it's like somehow my vision like speeds by me, like I'm on this speeding train and I
yeah,
have this vision, and then by the next stop I'm like, where'd it go? Oh, I left it back in that other town because
yeah,
I'm just speeding along,
yeah,
and I feel like I'm being carried and I'm not even able to get off the train. And so, do I have a question here? No, it's just more of a noticing, like,
yeah,
we're in this is a weird improv score, like as
for
a
sure.
culture.
But the mythic illiteracy has a cost and a consequence for the ground that we stand on. The unwillingness uh, of the people who have that absolutely understandable hunger makes it less livable for every single person, human and non-human. And due to, I mean, there's a laundry list of things that which you could, shrug your shoulders at. Enforced monogamy, agriculture, domestication of fire, etc. There's so many people who just need to simply eat,
That's right. That's right.
um, and it makes it
Simply
hard
eat.
just to simply eat. Um, but if you want to keep on taking from the world without feeding it, you're chopping on chopping the branch that you're standing on.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Um, what do you think are just some, like, what do you think are the gateway drugs, the animist gateway drugs that are just like not about giving someone a grand purpose? Because we're kind of going from this like, oh, I need a grand purpose and I need to have mystical visions. It's like, no, you don't.
I don't.
You just need to fucking like feel things more. It's about touching and it's about noticing and it's about awareing, but it's also about feeding,
Hmm.
right? It's not just me and my contemplative bubble, right? It's not like, and that's another thing. Mindfulness gets into this kind of like, intangible air-like quality a lot of times where I'm like, well, what about the things like, that matter? And you're talking about feeding, and you know, a lot of the great so-called revolutions in society are when people decided to feed people,
Hmm.
when the aristocracy or the ruling class was actively keeping food away from people,
Totally.
right? And so it's not just contemplative, it's like rebellious, anarchistic, but it's also deeply just like fucking normal. Like
Yeah.
people need to, like, we need to feed things. That's how it works.
Yeah. But so if you're Fred Hampton and you're a Black Panther and you're feeding people, or you're Fubaro Nakamoto from One Straw Revolution, I mean, there's incredible, I mean, so Watari Maganthi, who did all the tree planting for food in Africa. I mean, like, yeah, this is revolutionary work is to just to feed people, but it also could just be to grow things. But like, I don't think there's so many souls who are out there, and who there's how many 9 people are listening to this? I don't know, however many
Yeah,
are,
sure.
um, or 90
Nine
or
and three
900 or 9,000,
quarters.
9 3/4. Um, Whoever is, I don't know what their inclination is, but it could be through poetry, it could be through the thumb of your tongue, but it could be through it could be the tongue of your hand when you're making something. So it could be, wood carving or stitching, but it could be singing, it could be theater, it could be dancing, it could be and your doorway could be fighting monkey. Your doorway could be, I'm going to decide to plant a mushroom garden in my backyard. I'm going to
Right.
grow tobacco. I'm going to grow tomatoes because they're the easiest thing that anyone can grow. Um, I'm going to start, you know, planting things that attract songbirds and butterflies.
Yeah.
It could be that. It could be, I'm going to know my neighbors. That could be just as alive too.
Right. And these are
It could
ritual
be like,
actions. They're not just kind of whatevers, you
oh,
know.
totally, they're huge. But you could say, I'm going to bury every dead bird I find,
That's right.
and give it a proper burial. Um, those are like legit. That I don't know if you've seen that woman on Instagram, Amanda Stronza. This woman pulls over on the highway. She lives in Central Texas and gives a proper burial to house cats, dogs, birds, snakes, armadillos, and takes a picture of like an altar that she makes around them, taking them away from the highway. This woman like fucks up her commute every single day.
Yeah, because
Um,
she's looking for it. She's on the
she's look,
prowl.
she's on the prowl, but she sees that it's needed in the world.
Right. Right.
Um, and and you can tell by her language around it, it's not self-congratulatory or show-offy, or that she's just one of these easy to tears sorts of persons. And we know those people who like can just weep functionally on command and sort of is a little overwrought with that. It's really honest. It's a real skill that she's cultivated.
Right.
Um, that she'll sometimes say like the face of this badger was too torn up, so I wanted to have that to the ground. And so it looks uncomfortable to you, but I swear it's for the sake of the dignity of this little one. It's incredible, the noticing,
Yeah.
considering them still alive even as they are absolutely dead. Those, is that your practice? Like, I couldn't have predicted that would have been a valuable way for a woman to make an Instagram post, but she refuses the uh, any role of influencer. People ask her for guidance and like, what should I do? And she's like,
Nope.
nope.
Right. Right. She's just a practitioner.
She's just a
She's just
practitioner.
like this is what I do, and the doing is the feeding is what
Yeah,
I'm getting.
absolutely. And there's a real skill to it. And if you look at her first post versus her 500th, which of course there's no lack of dead animals on the stretch that she's driving, you can see that there's a skill in her language, there's a skill in her arrangement. Not that it's better, the first one is just as raw, but
Hmm.
there's a skill that comes just from the doing again and again and again.
Right. Yes, yes, yes. And there's
So
a there's
your
there's
way could be pottery. Your way could be
yeah,
learning how to sift clay from your backyard and making beads and giving those beads back to the place that you're from.
right. And there's a freshness in the process, I think, that
Yeah,
we're talking about here. It's like a lot of times practice is boring because it's repetitive or too familiar or something. And I think that one of the skills inside of what we're talking about is this, yeah, just how to defamiliarize yourself with something so the fresh nature can actually be perceived again.
yeah, and it's not going to be fresh every time. You
No,
know,
it's not. It's not. You're not. No, totally. It's that. It's back to that rhythm again. It's like, oh, I did the same thing again.
that's
Like I
exactly
did
right.
that. I did that thing that I love to do that I don't even know why it's so easy for me to do. And on some level, that too is valuable. But it's not necessarily the same thing as like being in a process of awareness around what comes through you, essentially.
Yeah, of
right? Because habits are coming through me all the time. They're just like
course.
something moved my arm over there, and it was the
Yeah,
habit of turning on the light that's over there, you know?
yeah,
But I do feel like a lot of the practices that people applaud, especially in the West, when they're like, I don't want to be an animist, but I love this thing, and you're like, you're kind of a fucking animist, you know? Like you know what I mean? Like
sure.
it's
Yeah,
like, well, and if you notice, they're all things like Tai Chi or Qigong or Feldenkrais or something that forces you to slow down and get into some kind of flow state in which you have to pay very close
yeah,
attention, bird watching, you know, like
yeah.
people are
Praying the
doing,
rosary.
yeah, they're things that are like, you can't necessarily rush the process if you want to do the process.
Hmm. Yeah,
They're like, there's this built-in limiter where it's like, if you want to do this and get the benefits of doing it, it forces you on some way. It's a creative constraint, right? It's a
yeah,
constraint that you can't necessarily mindlessly speed it up and do it. It's not the same thing anymore. It's just,
yeah,
it's something else, you know?
yeah,
And to find those that speak to you, because like you just gave a bunch of great examples, it's not going to be the same for everyone. Not everybody's going to be like, I do Tai Chi and that's how I feed God or whatever, you know
yeah.
what I mean? That's how I feed the grief of life. And not everyone's going to do that. And some people who do Tai Chi aren't even doing it for that reason. They've got a
For
different
sure.
reason. They're
Yeah,
like, you know, they're feeding something else. So it's like the bevy of choices is wide. The menu options are vast, right? The
yeah.
menu options are
Properly
vast.
so.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. Like that's necessary.
Yeah,
We don't want everyone to be doing the same grief practice, even if we think that's somehow the answer to our problems.
yeah. 100%. I mean, the notion that we should, there's something very powerful about everyone doing the same thing all at once, and that you see that with coordinated dances as an example, or melodic choruses where everyone's singing the same thing. That can be incredible. Like if you see any video of a haka, you're like, oh
Yes.
my god, like it's so powerful, like the unity of it.
Yes.
Um, and all those all the practicing, all the elsewheres, something emerges from those skills because we need you in order to cover the world, in order to have a relationship with the world. We need you to find you. We need to proceed as if you're needed to have the relationship that you can have with the corner of the world that you're in, not with the
That's
whole
right.
world. We
Yes.
don't need you for the whole world, just
Right.
the corner that you're in. That's
Right.
enough.
Like to every human, it's like a tiny garden that only you can tend. So you better get to it, kid. You know?
Yeah, and I'd say like um, that it is a garden, and then if you're lucky, it gets a little bit more horticultural. That it's a little bit wild, it's a little bit cultivated. Um,
Yeah.
that you allow some of what wants to happen, and a little bit of your hand. And you know, to go back to that potter's analogy, which I used briefly before, if it's all inner hand, it's too much expansion, and you don't have a pot. And if it's all outer hand and all discipline, it never expands. So finding that playfulness and to also know like, okay, it's done. It's not too wet. It's not too dry. And this is itself. Let's take it off and see how we create again and
Yeah.
see what the next uh, lump of clay wants.
Right. Right. And that's that thing again, coming back to the freshness of the moment, which is a new container. I'm shaping that container, the container shaping me.
Totally.
You know, like this back and forth quality of everyone shaping. And like when I was when I was doing more, physical theater, improv stuff more often, which was, quite a few years ago at this time, I did have the spiritual experience of the sensory perception, the viscerality of a bunch of people shaping the same thing at the same time and then awakening to that reality. Like, oh, you and I are actually working on the same piece of clay. I didn't, you
Yeah.
have this dawning moment where you're shaping your own internal experience. How do I enter the space? How do I interact? What's my character? What's my motivation, right?
Yep.
You have this kind of I'm shaping my clay or the clay is shaping me. And then there are these moments of like, oh, the audience is shaping us,
Oh
or
yeah.
like
Absolutely.
or whatever, the stars are shaping me and my dance. I'm no longer the individual potter. I
Hmm.
am actually in a kind of collaborative potting
Yeah,
session
I'm being
or
potted.
playmaking session. Yeah. Yeah, and that's that interesting place where you talk about things like the erotic, and you eventually get to a really dicey word that means some things, and that's surrender.
Yeah,
And I want to kind of finish our conversation today talking a little bit about your experience as a body worker,
yeah,
this concept or this force or this spirit that we call surrender that can mean multiple things, not all of which are groovy,
yeah,
right? But I'm really just, I'm curious about your dancing with these practices and this spirit. Like, how do people come to you for surrender or not? Are you trying to help people find surrender? Is surrender just an accidental byproduct of some other process? And of course, how does that relate to improv and some of the other things we've been talking about?
yeah. Um, so my in non-COVID times, I've been a part-time body worker, though there's been a little glimpse of more of that work emerging recently, but it's still pretty thin. And I've never um, I've never advertised. It's always been word of mouth, because the type of body work that I do, which was called tantric body work, it definitely has a strong sexual element to it. Um, and while I don't use my mouth or my genitals, and I'm a trained body worker, um, it's definitely in a gray area of the law. I think that's fair to say. Um, and so I have to be really good about my boundaries and not promoting it. But also, I sort of feel like women, and so in the way I got into it is its own story. Um, but the premise is that the vast majority of people who come to see me for help are women, who want help moving that intersection of spiritual and sexual energy in their bodies to move it something that's going on in their lives. And if you're a woman who lives in this non-culture antibiotic, you are on the menu for breakfast every day, whether you want to or not. And if you're not on the menu, you know that you're not on the menu too, and that can have its own sort of grief. And um, so people come to me for all sorts of reasons, but it may be because they want to, have the biggest orgasm of their life, which I can't guarantee them that they'll have at all, or that they feel like there's, a novel that's stuck in them and it somehow has to do with their pussy. Could be that they want a safe experience of the masculine. Um, there's lots of reasons people come. Um, and while for a first session, there's plenty of improv that happens, but I do have a bit of like a structure for the first one. You never know what's going to show up. Um, but I remember one particular woman who came and said, like, all my friends recommended you and you're so great. And I hear such good things about you. And I want to come to you because it's time for me to have a G spot orgasm. It's really important that I have a G spot orgasm. And I said, well, that's great. I can't guarantee you that you're going to have one. Um, but I'm glad to know your intentions are being set for this session. She says, okay. So we go to the session, we start the session, and I don't go leaping straight for the genitals. It's literally the last things that I touch, if they get touched at all. I mean, there's no like mandatory, like I don't need to touch anyone's genitals, but they're included because they're in your body and they are your body and they're important. You don't want to maximize or minimize them. Anyways, let's just say this one was amply bosomed, and I was asked for permission for her breast to be touched, and she sort of rolled her eyes. She was like, I mean, sure, but like, can we just like get to like the biggest G spot orgasm of my life and like see what we get there? And I started to tend to her breasts, and she started having tears, and the tears started turning into moans, and the moans turned into wails, and the wails started turning into um, aching and shaking and like, gut level crying, into that like keening level where she's like screaming, crying, and I'm like the massaging's not happening, and I'm just holding her, and you can't hold that level of keening for too long because it's just too much on the chassis, and the keening gears down to wailing, down to moaning, down to crying, down to sniffling. We never got to her genitals, and as she spoke about it, we checked in about it, the next day, and she said, my breasts have always been treated like grab bags and pillow cushions and radio dials, and I never realized how much I'd shut off all sensation in them, and I started to feel so deeply in my breasts. And so she said it. She said, I had a grief orgasm. I cried for all the sensations I've lost for years. And now I couldn't have known, like, your no training ever prepares you for that. Like, this woman is like exploding into tears.
Yes.
Um, and she's in an incredibly vulnerable spot. And some if you found yourself in that situation, a lot of people would be like, okay, like, get it together. It's time for the session to end. Like, let's pause and like, here's some essential oils. Let's smell it out. But like, it had a life, and she never got her biggest G spot orgasm of her life. And we ended up having another 2 or 3 sessions. But I had to be with the grief of that, and the fact that the next day she was like, I'm so, like, she could laugh about it. She was like, I'm so glad I had that. I didn't know that it was possible to have that sort of shaking grief orgasm. And in the pantheon of orgasms, you sort of think like, oh, cervical, vaginal, penis, full body, breath, butt orgasm, like whatever it is, like, and maybe if you're really esoteric, like elbow or toes, but like a grief orgasm is not high on people's lists. But that became one that emerged as was a possibility. So I was very lucky to be in the presence of that, and so I had to bring all my skills of allowing my nervous system to have a life, improv, play, but also serious play. Not play like, yeah, man, like, I'm a contact improviser. Woohoo! I'm doing this now.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
um, it was serious play. And
Mhm.
so that was, one example of um, one, variant that could emerge in a bodywork session, and it will never happen again. Of course not.
Right. But just speaking to that level of like, given the right conditions, something like surrender and grace might actually appear, but it's probably not going to be the thing we chose when we entered that conditional matrix, right? It's like Law
Absolutely.
and
And
Order
so at
is
the end
off
of
the
that,
menu.
absolutely. And so, what I do at the end of all my sessions is I try to speak to the spirit or the god or gods that emerged in that time. So this is part of like my closing, to say like, if I notice the tattoo, if I notice that there were tears, I might speak to the old salt god and say, thank you for appearing. If the tears emerged, you can say, to that particular version of it. If there was tightness in their body, which I hate when body workers are like, oh, you're really tight, whatever that spirit of protection was in these old hips, so that they showed up and spoke. Whoever made it possible, who's unseen but hasn't been invited into the room, you got to thank them for making an appearance.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Everybody's welcome, and also all the uninvited guests have been invited, and you did not invite them.
Exactly. But I I don't remember the exact words I said for that particular session, but it was something around that fearless, surrendering spirit that needed to arise on this day to make everything actually let go. We could not have done this if you have not shown up and shown your face, all of it.
Right. Beautiful. Yeah, right. It's like, and to me, that's where we get into like what I think of as like the soul of animism, which is that yes, it's place-based, yes, it's land-based, yes, it's differentiated, yes, there are multiple kinds of beings, they all are different. And yet there is a kind of protocol that applies to almost every kind of spiritual encounter that I seem to have, which is like one is this is happening and I didn't do it and you exist and I have to say yes to your
Yep.
existence, which is a kind of saying yes to it being part of you. Like, I mean,
Sure.
otherwise, like you can't really get around how like these experiences of so-called difference and other and prayer to another, right? It's like I'm talking to you. There's a certain point in the process of living and dying that is the the river entering into the ocean, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's like no, what you thought was different is not actually different, and that's the thing we're here to sort of tend of like, wow, there's something emerged and it was different and actually not so different, right?
Yeah.
Like not actually that different, and yet, and that's that both and. It's like when I'm improving with the spirits, I have to. It's like everything's on the table, and that's that
Yeah. But you also don't
paradoxical.
need to, I don't think you need to necessarily automatically run to the no different part.
Right,
I
right,
think
right,
that
right.
that can be a very easy place to be like, well, ultimately it's all the same.
Yeah,
And
that exactly. You're right. That's a habituated kind of thing, right? Like
yeah,
rushing towards a kind of conclusion that is like puts your mind at ease or some garbage like that, you
yeah,
know?
I mean, you can, that's sort of like and I have a great admiration for Advaita Vedanta or that sort of notion. Like ultimately, it's all that, everything's illusion. But yes, and let's not dodge the fact that this thing actually happened, and the river is a very alive place. And at the very end of the river, that's when it touches and kisses the ocean. But man, this whole river is still happening, and the bend in it is real, and that slows enough for something remarkable to happen and for life to happen here.
Yes, that's right.
Um,
Right.
yeah,
There's a particularity I think that we're talking to here, which is that you can't blank out on the moment that's actually happening, which is like, oh no,
yeah,
a spirit's here, and or like,
yep,
and that spirit looks like this to me, or I feel these sensations in my body
yep,
in relation to what's happening. Like, we can't just go, oh, that's anger, and now I know anger is bad, and I have to do my 14 wrathful practices to transmute this anger. I'm like, no, 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 no. It's like get to the place where you could actually be like a connoisseur of that
oh yeah,
sensational matrix. Like
yeah,
before it became anger in your mind, what was it? You know, like that
mm,
kind of thing. Like before we labeled it in our
yeah,
kind of habituated, I need to have safety, so I'm going to label everything that I can sense, you know?
mhm,
Before we did that, before the system does that, what was going on or what is still going on, which is
yeah,
again that thing of time. It's like the river, even that we're at this side of the river, doesn't mean the other side of the river is not happening.
totally,
So, like, we think we're here in time. The other side of time, river, is still happening. It's
yeah,
still going on.
very much so.
So, to sort of cast our glance to that and go, oh, yeah, that too, and maybe that is even more primary as some kind of like encountering or touching, right? Like,
Yeah,
the touch that happens, it's you know, it's a very mysterious kind of thing we're talking about here because it's really hard to name what the fuck we're talking about, right? It's like
yeah,
there is a kind of touch that precedes or prefigures touch, is I guess what I'm saying.
yeah,
And that energy is very real and very visceral when we play with it.
yeah,
Like we actually have to play with that sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, that's that wide open space, again,
very much so.
wide open. Well, this was a great conversation.
Yeah, it was.
Matthew, is there anything you're doing that's a new project that you'd love to talk about or plug or let people know where they can find some of your cool stuff that you're doing or making or have made?
Sure. Yeah. I'd say my skincare company, primalderma.com, is a skincare product made out of grass-fed beef tallow. It's worked really well. It's been the skincare of choice for people for at least 20,000 years around the world. And so I write about all this stuff about culture and death and endings and history and anthropology and making meaning in the context. I mean, there's no skincare tips whatsoever, but the fact that I'm unrepentant about saying that this comes from an animal that died and it was raised well and was tended to and remembered. How do we remember that um, in culture and making meaning? So I write about that every week in my newsletter in varying ways. So I'd say that. If you want to buy some skincare, that'd be great too.
Yeah, but really, your newsletter is a kind of, I mean, I can attest to this. Like, it's not about skincare, but it is about skincare.
That's skincare. Exactly. Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm gonna get a mini essay from Matthew that goes places I did not expect, and it's really good stuff.
Exactly.
It's really
Yeah.
good
Thank
stuff.
you.
And just
Yeah.
so you know,
I hate writing. I hate writing it so much. I hate writing with a deep and abiding passion, but I know they come out with it. So
great, awesome. Well, so
yeah.
there's that kind of stuff. I will maybe put some links in the show notes to some of the books that you can find on Amazon or somewhere else, and
Yep.
sort of put the Primal Derma website and all of that up there for people. This has been really cool. I'm sure that you and I could make this a regular habit and
No
talk
doubt.
about new
No doubt.
things every time.
No. No
So
question.
maybe so let's just say to be continued. Thank you so
To be
much,
continued.
Matthew. Thank you so much for coming on the Underworld party and just having a great conversation with me. I hope I hope that everyone listening is getting something out of these really weird places we're going. Thank you all so much for
Yeah.
listening.
We covered some wild ground.
Yeah, and that's what I love. Covering the wild ground is another great, way to
Yeah.
sort of talk about it because like I'm trying to wander in the woods with my guests,
Yeah.
like I don't freaking know what we're doing. Like
I hear
I ain't
you.
got a plan, like I had some questions, but I don't know where we're gonna go. So
Yeah.
it always brings up and what I think is interesting just on a meta level of like the art of conversation as a feeding ritual, because
Hmm.
that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is
Totally.
that interviews when I record them in succession refer to other interviews in that
Yeah.
like family of interviews. It's
Yeah.
very fascinating that like there is a connection, even if that connection is just brought through my body. I feel it bubbling up. I feel this kind of like the myth that 3 guests ago somebody we start talking about this and it shows up
It's
five
very fungal. It's
conversations
very,
later.
very fungal.
Yeah, very fungal stuff. So that's what sort of makes me kind of keep doing it because I'm also improving with the format itself, and
Totally.
I'm discovering new grounds to cover that are like, wow, we could go visit that place again. That was crazy.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Matthew, thank you so much. Blessings to you and all your relations. Thank you for everyone listening. That's it for today, folks. Bye bye. Have a good one. Tend to your gardens. Feed your dead. Do it. We told you to, so you should do it. It'll save your life. I promise. Wah wah.